We're back in Infant Baptism and Reformation, Geneva. This is by Karen Spierling. And today we're going to look at Chapter 2, which is Catholic Baptismal Traditions in Reformed Geneva. In Chapter 3 of this chapter, and this is Chapter 3 of a total of 6 chapters plus the conclusion. And this particular chapter is about 40 pages long. There are 7 sections and then a conclusion. So we'll go through each of those sections. But in Chapter 3, Spierling examines how Catholic baptismal traditions stubbornly endured within Reformed Geneva, despite every efforts by reformers to reshape the ceremony. It is a fascinating story of theology, tradition, and a human instinct towards the familiar. So it begins in Chapter 3 with the case of Percival Roger, who had his son secretly rebaptized in the Catholic tradition. He had previously been baptized in the Reformed tradition. Spierling notes, this is a quote on page 63. Here we see not only the involvement of the city magistrates in enforcing the Reformed doctrine and policies, but also the challenge to those policies, the ongoing parental concern to ensure the salvation of a child through Catholic traditions. So this tension that exists sets the stage for everything else in this chapter. So section 1 is comparing Catholic and Reformed Genevan baptisms. Catholic baptism, as we know from this book and others, was highly ritualized, involving exorcisms, anointing of oil, salts, the blessing of holy water, etc., which she writes that they functioned in a social manner, strengthening family and community ties. And then by contrast, the Reformed ceremony stripped away these elements. In Geneva, in other cities in Switzerland, some of those ceremonies remained their course for a short duration, but in Geneva, all of that was stripped. Quote, she writes, no longer did the minister sanctify the water, nor did he apply chrism to the infant to confirm the baptism. Furthermore, reformers eliminated the exorcisms that had long been part of the baptismal ritual. In Geneva, the exorcisms were cut quickly. In other cities like Bern, it took some time. Water and the word alone would suffice. The next section, section 2, is in regard to emergency baptisms. In Hughes' Oliphant Old, The Shaping of the Reformed Baptismal Rite in the 16th Century, has a section, or chapter rather, on itself for emergency baptisms, but Spierling here covers the same. Catholic traditions, midwives could perform emergency baptisms in a scenario like the child seemed close to death. But in Geneva, the Reformed practice was to reject this. She writes, quote, Calvin insisted that a minister must perform every baptism and that each one must occur in a church before the congregation, which of course is no minor change, as a dramatic challenge to deeply ingrained fears about infant salvation. Of course, within the Reformed tradition, they did not subscribe to a regenerative view of baptism, so the baptized baby was not being saved from hell. And that was a tradition. Again, as Hughes Oliphant Old paints the picture of an unfolding practice that led to emergency baptisms, was the view that if a baby died without being baptized with water, that baby would, with absolute certainty, go to hell. So, early church certainly didn't believe that, but that was a developed tradition, and of course that would naturally lead to emergency baptisms if it were the case that you believed in such. Section 3, this is delayed baptisms. Delayed baptism caused deep anxiety among Genevan ministers. Anabaptists, after all, they rejected infant baptism, and the delay in itself looked suspicious. Spierling points out that in reality, delays were often mundane. She writes, quote, despite the consistory's concerns, few Anabaptists frequented Geneva after the 1530s. The reasons for delayed baptisms generally had little to do with religious doctrine and more to do with practical or logistical matters. Section 4 is on rebaptisms. If delay worried the Reformers, rebaptism, according to Spierling, outright horrified them. That was the example given at the beginning of this chapter. A Catholic baptism might be seen as flawed, but it was still seen as legitimate within the Reformed tradition. There's dispute today in regard to that, but generally speaking, in the Reformed community, a Trinitarian baptism is construed as a legitimate baptism. The Reformers were rebaptizers, such as the Anabaptists, who viewed the initial infant baptism as illegitimate, so they wouldn't have seen themselves as rebaptizing anyone, but the Reformers would have recognized the baptisms, the Trinitarian baptisms within the Roman tradition as legitimate baptisms, so they wouldn't have rebaptized children. Spierling writes, in part because rebaptism would have attacked the very core of Christian identity. She writes, for the Reformers, rebaptism was an even greater concern than Catholic baptism. The Catholic rite might have been full of superstition and excess, but at base, it was still a Christian baptism. Excuse me. One baptism was enough. To rebaptize was to undermine the authority of Christ's command. And then section 5 was the absence of fathers. Fathers were expected to be publicly present at the baptism of their children, and then failing to appear would naturally have raised quite serious concerns. Spierling captures this, where she says, quote, Reformed expectations required parents to alter their behavior and patterns of socializing with the insistence upon paternal attendance at baptism. So it wasn't just about ceremony. There was also an element of public responsibility, both for the family and for the congregation itself. Section 6 is godparents and naming. Godparents remained an important, although if transformed element of baptisms, not just infant baptisms. The Reformed tradition tried to downplay spiritual kinship, according to Spierling. Traditions clung tightly, naming customs linked baptism to broader family networks. Spierling is outside the Reformed tradition in her own conviction. That's obvious from this book. And so this is a very sociological approach to 16th century baptisms in Geneva. Let's see. She writes, quote, generally the midwife, accompanied by the godparents and a celebratory party of friends and relatives, would carry the baby to the church, unquote. Section 7 is the celebration of baptism. So despite the sober intentions of Reformed theology, Spierling uses this connotation, the sober intentions of Reformed theology. Baptism often ended in communal celebration. It was certainly something to celebrate. It was the reception of the sign and seal of God's covenant of grace. Church authorities worried about excessive partying, of course, which I suppose is understandable. But they could do little to stop the natural instincts of family and festivity. She writes towards the end of the chapter, quote, church and city authorities were especially sensitive to the behavior of parents at this moment in their children's lives, seeking affirmation that these church members were committed to Reformed faith and practice. And then the last roughly page and a half is the conclusion of this chapter, where Spierling concludes that in the end, Geneva's reformers successfully reshaped baptism, but they did not erase Catholic tradition overnight. She says, and this quote here, even while they were arguing, challenging, and confronting one another, parents and reformers in Geneva were together designing the framework within which they would all raise the children of Geneva. Not a story of simple conquest, but from her view, it's a story of adaptation and negotiation and eventually a reluctant continuity. So this is chapter 3, Catholic baptismal traditions in Reformed Geneva. And there are some stories in here. So For instance, with Percival, the chapter begins with this example. Her sources are all secondary in nature. And she does a footnote where she's finding these stories. They're from other books. She's not going to the original sources, which, this book was written, this is the second edition in 2009, but this book was written in 2005. So there was certainly limitations as to the accessibility of primary source texts that she may have gone to. But this is chapter 3. Chapter 4 moves into godparents, a tradition reformed. So we'll end it there for today. And that's chapter 3 of infant baptism in Reformation, Geneva.